The first storyteller who I'd like to bring to you tonight. He is a member of our church, this church. He has done so many things for the last 30 years. He has been a consultant, a teacher, a researcher. He's worked with universities and other organizations, 30 years of experience, travels around the world. We're lucky to have him with us tonight. Would you please welcome Larry Prusak?
Thank you. I call this How I Came to Understand Injustice. This is a story about what happened to me in 1957 in Brooklyn, New York. The old Brooklyn, not the one where your kids live. I grew up in a neighborhood, Crown Heights, that seemed to my innocent eyes pretty well integrated. Maybe 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 blacks, and the rest was the typical ethnic mix of those days. I went to the local public school, and from the first grade, we were sorted into groups based on some test formula. Reading scores, IQ, we never could figure out what it was. But I had the same classmates for all the grades until high school. They were all white until the 8th grade. There were no middle schools back then, when a black kid transferred into our class. His name was Richie Powers, and he sat next to me based on our last names. At first, he was very shy and reserved, and I wasn't. So I tried to get to know him. I was curious as how he got into our class and who he was. It turned out he had recently moved north from Alabama to our neighborhood where he had some relatives. His father worked as a janitor for 3 buildings close by, and Richie helped him after school, bringing out the cans of ashes that the apartment houses generated from burning coal. After a few weeks, we were in math class, a course I hated. Math was my worst subject, and I hated being called on to perform in one of those damned math bees we were subject to. That day, the teacher started by giving us an exercise, asking us to multiply 2 numbers by 2 numbers. As I wrote down the numbers, I heard Richie murmur something. It was a number that sounded like it could be the right answer. He had done it in his head in 3 seconds. When the teacher asked who got the answer, I saw Richie didn't raise his hand, although he had gotten it earlier than anyone else. I was amazed and excited as I believed he was the answer to my unheard prayers. He must have had some secret recipe for doing math, quicker than anyone else. I beseeched him to share with me his secret. I offered money, comic books, candy, or anything else I could procure. But he insisted he could just do it. There wasn't any secret he could teach me. Damn. I couldn't understand how this could be, but he was so sincere and sweet in his answer, I knew it must be true. I think he felt a little sorry for me, and also somewhat amazed that a smart white kid wanted something he had. I thought about this endlessly and began to see that he had some lightning-fast calculating gift that neither I nor anyone else in the school had ever seen, though he was sure shy and drawing attention to himself, a legacy, no doubt, from Alabama. A few weeks later, we were gifted with one of those goddamn puzzles. If 7 farmers had 13 sheep and 12 barrels of wool and 3 boats to cross the river, you know what I mean. Again, Richie just knew the answer in about 7 seconds. He told me he could just see it, the sheep and everything. But he was too modest to yell out the answer, as any of us would have done immediately. Slowly, the teachers and other kids caught on to his powers, and he got some recognition, but he remained very cautious and reserved. I once asked him to come to a special sale the library was having of used books. Kids' books were only a dime. He told me he had to help his father, which probably was true, but it may have been more true that he didn't have the dime. One day in spring, we were given yet another test to determine which course of study we would be following in high school, academic, commercial, or general. The test was math, vocabulary, and general information. Our teacher implied it wasn't a big deal, and we all took it with a lot of confidence. A few days later, Miss Scanlon, our teacher, gave us our results, and I saw Richie suddenly lower his head when he received his results. He was assigned to take a general course of study, dooming his chance of going to college in the near and probably far future. I'm still amazed after all these years. I was shocked and astounded. How could this be? He was smarter than me and probably smarter than anyone else in the school. But he showed me his score. He got every math and science question right, did worse than average on vocabulary, and failed the general information section. I thought maybe the idiot who graded his test was drunk. Stranger things than that had happened in this school, but it wasn't to be. I was so angry, but I slowly began to understand. How could a kid who got a terrible education in segregated Alabama, whose father was a janitor with little education, know the sort of things we all took for granted, things we just absorbed from our parents, from the church or synagogue, from schools, from the radio and TV, from talking to one another, from the streets, from the library, all the things Richie had never been exposed to? How would he know the words equestrian or circumnavigate or condone or how far the sun was from the earth? I ran up to Miss Scanlon, an old cantankerous woman who didn't like me or Richie or any other student. She just said the results spoke for themselves. I tracked down our math teacher, who seemed more open to discussion, but she said there was nothing to be done. I then went to see the school principal, Dr. Abramovitz, a stately large man who always spoke to us in very authoritarian tones. He knew who I was because I was often sent to his office for misbehavior. I spoke to him of my anger at this miscarriage, and he told me that I would understand this much better when I was older. I may not have known much math, but I surely knew when I was being bullshitted to. I was getting angrier and angrier, but hadn't the words or tools in which to argue my case. Not that it would have mattered a great deal. My parents were of no use. They had their own troubles and weren't interested in anyone else's problems. Richie left school that day in a hurry and hadn't returned the next day. When he returned, I had no idea what to say to him, so we both sat silently in our adjoining seats all the long day. He sad and me furious. I thought about writing to a congresswoman who I once knew for passing out pamphlets, but I knew she wouldn't care. Slowly, I began to see nobody really cared. And as the school term wore on to its end, Richie and I spoke far less than before. And when I tried to bring up the subject, he looked away and asked me not to talk about it. He had become resigned to the situation. He was deflated. We went to the same high school, but took different classes. I met him once, walking home, but he didn't really want to talk to me. I met him on the subway 4 years later. I looked like a college student, and he was working in South Brooklyn at a large freight warehouse, helping with the accounts, he said. I didn't have the heart to ask him if he ever thought of attending night college, as my father had. It just didn't seem to work. He nodded goodbye, and that was it. A few years later, I heard he had died. No word ever reached me as how. I took all sorts of social science courses in college and graduate school, many of them dealing with the words democracy, justice, opportunity, equality, but none of them ever mentioned Richie. And while I could parrot back the words I needed to, I couldn't help thinking of my friend and what would or could have saved him. But none of these fine thoughts I was reading were much about him. In the past decades, there's surely been some progress in righting some of these wrongs that destroyed my friend from so long ago. Wonderful thinkers like John Rawls and Amartya Sen have written about how a just society would help everyone in it to develop their own capabilities to the fullest extent that they can. I'll leave it to you to think about how much progress we have made in this direction and how far we still need to go in order to allow people like my friend Richie to fully become who they can be. Thank you.